gunshot that killed Ethan Owens' brother echoed through the canyon long after the bullet had done its work, and for 365 days afterward he spoke to no living soul except the chestnut mare who carried him through his grief. It happened on a Tuesday in the spring of 1876 just outside Agua Caliente, Arizona, where the desert stretched endless and unforgiving beneath a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Samuel Owens had been 24 years old, barely 2 years younger than Ethan, and he had died with his hand reaching toward the holster he never got to draw. The man who shot him rode off into the dust, and though the sheriff organized a search party, the killer vanished like water into sand. Ethan had held his brother while the light left his eyes, whispering promises he did not know how to keep, feeling something fundamental break inside his chest that he suspected would never properly heal. The funeral was attended by half the town, folks who had known Samuel as the charming Owens brother, the one with the easy smile and the quick laugh. Ethan stood beside the grave with his hat in his hands, his jaw set so tight it ached, and when people offered their condolences, he nodded once and said nothing. The words felt stuck somewhere between his heart and his throat, caught in a tangle of rage and sorrow so dense he could not breathe around it. After they laid Samuel in the ground, Ethan went home to the small ranch they had worked together, packed a bedroll and supplies onto his horse, and left. He did not say goodbye to anyone. He did not leave a note. He simply mounted his mare, a 4-year-old chestnut named Copper he had raised from a foal, and rode out into the vastness of the Arizona territory with no destination in mind. For the first week, he camped in different places each night, always far from towns and settlements. He tended to Copper with methodical care, brushing her coat, checking her hooves, ensuring she had good grazing and clean water. And he talked to her. At first the words came haltingly, his voice rough from disuse and tears, but Copper would turn her large brown eyes on him, ears swiveling to catch every syllable, and something about her patient attention made it easier. "I should have been faster," he told her one night, sitting beside a small fire while she grazed nearby. "I saw the man reach for his gun. I saw it happening, and I still could not stop it." Copper lifted her head and nickered softly, then returned to pulling at the tough desert grass. Ethan watched the flames dance and felt the emptiness expand inside him. By the second month, he had developed a routine. He worked odd jobs at remote ranches, places where they needed an extra hand for a few days or weeks, and did not ask questions about a man who kept to himself. He mucked stalls, mended fences, broke horses that needed gentle handling. The ranch owners would try to engage him in conversation, but Ethan would shake his head and point to his throat, and they assumed he could not speak. He let them believe it. The only words he spoke were to Copper, always when they were alone. "Met a woman today," he told the mayor one evening in June, after he had finished a week of work at a cattle ranch near Tucson. "She brought lunch out to the hands, had brown hair and kind eyes. She smiled at me, and I could not smile back. I do not know how to anymore." Copper stamped her hoof and shook her mane, and Ethan reached out to stroke her neck. The simple warmth of her, the solid reality of her presence, was the only thing that felt real to him in those days. The woman he had mentioned was named Margaret, though he did not know that yet. Margaret Bailey was 23 years old, the daughter of a ranch owner whose land sprawled across several thousand acres of Arizona desert. Her father, Thomas Bailey, ran one of the most successful cattle operations in the territory, and Margaret had been raised to understand every aspect of the business. She could ride as well as any cowboy, could rope a steer, could read the sky for weather signs, but she also had a gentleness about her that seemed at odds with the harsh landscape, a quality that made her notice things others overlooked. She noticed Ethan Owens the moment he rode onto her father's property looking for work. It was not because he was handsome, though he was, in a weathered sort of way, with dark hair that needed cutting and gray eyes that held storms. It was because of the way he moved, deliberate and careful, like someone trying not to break apart. And it was because of the way he looked at his horse with a tenderness that suggested Copper was the only thing in the world that mattered to him. Her father hired him for fence work, a job that would take at least 2 weeks. Ethan set up camp at the edge of the property, refusing the bunkhouse, and each morning he would ride out to whichever section needed mending. Margaret made it her business to bring water and food to the workers, a task she had performed for years, but she found herself timing her visits to coincide with where Ethan was working. The first time she approached him, he was digging a post hole in ground so hard it might as well have been stone. Sweat darkened his shirt, and his hat was pulled low against the brutal July sun. Margaret rode up on her palomino gelding, a canteen and a wrapped sandwich balanced in her saddlebag. "Afternoon," she called out, dismounting with easy grace. "Thought you might be thirsty." Ethan looked up, his hands still gripping the post hole digger. He nodded once, his expression carefully neutral, but he did not speak. Margaret felt the silence like a physical thing, but it did not unsettle her the way it might have others. She simply set the canteen and food on a flat rock and stepped back. "There is roast beef in the sandwich," she said, "and the water is fresh from the well this morning. You take your time." She watched him for a moment, noting the way his jaw worked as though he was fighting the urge to say something, but he remained silent, and after a beat, she remounted her horse and rode to the next section of fence line where other hands were working. That evening, when Ethan returned to his camp, he told Copper about the encounter. "She did not push," he said, unsaddling the mare and setting the tack carefully on a rock. "Most people, they want you to talk. They get uncomfortable with silence and try to fill it, but she just left the water and the food and went on her way." Over the following days, Margaret continued her routine, bringing supplies to the workers and always stopping by wherever Ethan was laboring. She never pressed him to speak, never asked questions about who he was or where he came from. Instead, she filled the silence with her own gentle observations. "The monsoons will start soon," she said one afternoon, shading her eyes to look at the clouds building on the horizon. "You can feel it in the air, the way everything gets heavy and waiting. I love that first storm, the way it breaks the heat and makes everything smell like rain and creosote." Ethan paused in his work to glance at the sky, and Margaret caught the briefest flicker of something in his expression, something that might have been agreement or memory. She smiled and rode on. Another day she found him working near a section of fence where a family of quail had made their nest. He had carefully worked around them, adjusting his path so as not to disturb the birds. Margaret sat on her horse and watched him for a moment before speaking. "You are kind to them," she said softly. "Not everyone would notice or care if they did." This time Ethan looked directly at her, and their eyes met for a long moment. Margaret felt something shift in her chest, a recognition of pain that mirrored pain, of loneliness that understood loneliness. Then he nodded just once and returned to his work. The 2 weeks stretched into 3, then 4, as Thomas Bailey found more projects that needed Ethan's skilled hands. Margaret was not certain if her father was genuinely overwhelmed with work or if he had noticed her interest in the silent cowboy and was trying to help in his own gruff way. Either way, she was grateful for the extra time. In late July, a situation arose that forced Ethan to break his self-imposed isolation from everyone except Copper, though still, he spoke no words. A wildfire started in the dry brush to the east of the Bailey Ranch, driven by fierce winds that pushed it toward the property with terrifying speed. Every hand was called to fight the blaze, digging fire breaks and beating back flames with wet blankets and grim determination. Ethan worked alongside the others through the night, his face blackened with soot, his hands blistered from the shovel handle. Margaret was there too, despite her father's protests, working as hard as any man. At one point, a shift in the wind sent a wall of flame racing toward a group of trapped cattle, and without thinking, Margaret ran toward them, trying to drive them to safety. Ethan saw her disappear into the smoke and felt his heart seize with a fear he had not experienced since the day Samuel died. He dropped his shovel and ran after her, his lungs burning with each breath of superheated air. He found her surrounded by panicked cattle, coughing and disoriented, unable to find her way out. Without hesitation, he grabbed her arm and pulled her close, guiding her through the chaos toward clear air. The cattle followed, their herd instinct overriding their panic, and they all burst free of the smoke together. Margaret collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath, and Ethan knelt beside her, his hand steady on her back. She looked up at him with streaming eyes and tried to speak, but he shook his head and helped her to her feet, supporting her weight as they walked further from the flames. By dawn, the fire was contained, and exhausted workers sat around in small groups drinking water and assessing the damage. Margaret searched for Ethan and found him with Copper checking the mare for any signs of injury from the long night. She approached slowly, every muscle in her body aching. "Thank you," she said, her voice hoarse from smoke. "You saved my life." Ethan looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something raw and exposed in his expression, a vulnerability he usually kept hidden. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, and the frustration that crossed his face was painful to witness. Instead, he reached out and gently brushed a streak of soot from her cheek, his calloused fingers surprisingly tender against her skin. Then he dropped his hand and turned back to his horse. Margaret watched him walk away and felt something crystallize inside her, a determination she had not known she possessed. This man, whoever he was, whatever burden he carried, had risked his life for hers without hesitation. And she realized, standing there in the gray dawn light with smoke still hanging in the air, that she wanted to know him. Not just know him, but understand him, reach whatever broken places he was protecting. She began to change her approach. Instead of just bringing supplies and making small talk, she started to simply be present. She would ride out to where he was working and sit nearby, not saying anything, just existing in the same space. Sometimes she brought a book and read aloud, not to him exactly, but near enough that he could hear if he wanted to listen. She chose stories carefully, adventures, tales of the frontier, nothing tragic or heavy. Ethan found himself looking forward to these visits with an anticipation that both comforted and frightened him. The sound of Margaret's voice reading about explorers and pioneers became something he associated with peace, a respite from the constant churning of his own dark thoughts. And her willingness to sit in silence with him, to not demand anything he could not give, felt like a gift he did not deserve but desperately needed. One afternoon in August, Margaret arrived to find Ethan sitting on the ground beside Copper, his head in his hands. She dismounted immediately, concern tightening her features. As she approached, she realized his shoulders were shaking, and she understood he was crying, though he made no sound. She did not hesitate. She sat down beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, and waited. After a while, Ethan lifted his head and looked at her with red-rimmed eyes. The anguish in his face made her throat tighten, but she kept her expression gentle and open. "I cannot imagine what you are carrying," she said quietly, "but you do not have to carry it alone. Not forever." Ethan stared at her, and she could see him wrestling with something internal, some battle between the need to maintain his silence and the desperate human need to be understood. Finally, he pulled a small leather journal from his saddlebag, something she had never seen him with before. He opened it to a blank page and, using a pencil he kept tucked in the binding, wrote in a cramped, urgent hand, "My brother was murdered. I watched him die. I could not save him." Margaret read the words twice, her heart breaking for this man beside her. She looked up and met his eyes. "When?" she asked softly. He wrote again, "1 year ago next April." "And you have not spoken since," she said, understanding washing over her. He shook his head and wrote, "Only to my horse." Margaret reached out slowly, giving him time to pull away if he wanted, and covered his hand with hers. "I'm so sorry," she said. "I'm so, so sorry." They sat like that for a long time, her hand on his, the desert sun beating down on them while Copper grazed peacefully nearby. When Ethan finally withdrew his hand, It was not out of rejection but necessity, as he needed it to write more. "Why do you keep coming here?" he wrote. "Why do you care?" Margaret considered the question carefully before answering. "Because I see you," she said simply. "Not the silence, not the walls you have built. I see the man who works around bird nests so he will not disturb them. The man who saved my life without thinking of his own. The man who loves his horse enough to keep talking to her when he will not speak to anyone else. That man is worth knowing." Ethan closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were bright with unshed tears. He wrote one more line. "I do not know how to come back from this." "Maybe you do not come back," Margaret said gently. "Maybe you move forward instead. Different than you were before, but still here. Still living." It was a turning point, though neither of them recognized it fully at the time. From that day on, Ethan carried the journal with him always. And when Margaret visited, they would have conversations of a sort, her speaking aloud and him writing responses. It was slow and imperfect, but it was communication, and it felt like progress. She learned about Samuel, about the ranch they had built together, about the gunman who had never been caught. She told him about her own losses, her mother, who had died giving birth to a stillborn son when Margaret was 15, leaving her to grow up too fast and take on responsibilities no girl should have to shoulder alone. "Grief is a strange thing," she said one evening as they sat watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. "It does not follow rules or timelines. People expect you to be over it after a certain amount of time, but it does not work that way. It just becomes part of you, like a scar that aches when it rains." Ethan wrote, "Yes, exactly that." As summer faded into fall, Thomas Bailey approached Ethan with an offer. "You are a hard worker," the older man said, his weathered face serious. "Reliable and skilled. I would like to offer you a permanent position here if you are interested. There is a small cabin on the north part of the property that needs some fixing up, but it could be yours. Good wages. Steady work." Ethan looked at Thomas for a long moment, then down at Copper, who stood patiently beside him. He thought about riding on, continuing his aimless wandering through the territory, speaking only to his horse and avoiding human connection. Then he thought about Margaret, about her quiet patience and the way she had sat with him in his grief without trying to fix him. He thought about how, for the first time since Samuel's death, he had felt something other than emptiness, even if that something was complicated and frightening. He nodded his acceptance, and Thomas clapped him on the shoulder. "Good man," he said. "You can move into the cabin by the end of the week. It is not much, but it is solid." Margaret helped him move in, bringing curtains she had sewn and a quilt her mother had made before she died. She did not make a fuss about it, just showed up one morning with the items and helped him hang the curtains and make up the bed. The cabin was indeed small, just one main room with a fireplace and a separate area for sleeping, but it had a window that looked out toward the mountains and a small corral for Copper. "It suits you," Margaret said, looking around with approval. "Quiet and solid." Ethan wrote, "Thank you for everything." "You're welcome," she replied, meeting his eyes. "I'm glad you are staying." The months that followed established a new rhythm. Ethan worked the ranch, his skills making him invaluable to Thomas, who began to trust him with more responsibility. He continued to speak only to Copper, long conversations in the evening after the day's work was done, processing his feelings and slowly, incrementally, working through his grief. But with Margaret he used the journal, and over time their written and spoken conversations became deeper, more personal. She told him about her dreams of expanding the ranch, of improving the breeding stock and maybe starting a horse training program. He wrote about his childhood in Kansas, about learning to ride before he could properly walk, about Samuel's laugh and the way his brother could charm anyone. Winter came to Arizona, cold nights and mild days, the desert landscape turning subtle shades of gold and brown. Margaret and Ethan began taking rides together in the late afternoons when the light turned soft and the air cooled. They did not go far, usually just around the ranch property, but there was an intimacy to those rides that both of them felt, but neither acknowledged directly. One December afternoon, they stopped beside a dry creek bed, and Margaret turned to Ethan with a question that had been building in her for weeks. "Do you think you will ever speak again?" she asked. "To people, I mean, not just Copper." Ethan dismounted and stood looking at the mountains in the distance. After a moment, he pulled out his journal and wrote, "I do not know. Sometimes I think about it. The words are there, I can feel them. But letting them out feels like giving up the last connection I have to who I was when Samuel was alive." Margaret read his words and nodded slowly. "I understand," she said. "But Ethan, you are not betraying him by living, by speaking, by being happy again." He wrote, "Am I allowed to be happy again?" "Yes," Margaret said firmly. "Yes, you are. Samuel would want that for you, would he not?" Ethan closed his eyes and thought about his brother, about Samuel's generous heart and easy smile. He knew Margaret was right. Samuel would hate knowing that Ethan had locked himself away in grief, that he had stopped fully participating in the world. But knowing it intellectually and feeling it emotionally were two different things. He wrote, "I think I am afraid." "Of what?" Margaret asked gently. "Of forgetting him. Of the pain fading and him fading with it." Margaret dismounted and came to stand beside him. "He will not fade," she said. "Love does not work that way. You will always carry him with you, but you can carry him in joy as well as in sorrow. You can live a full life and still honor his memory." Ethan looked at her, really looked at her, and felt something shift in his chest. This woman, who had no obligation to care about a broken cowboy who showed up on her father's ranch, had given him something precious. She had given him patience and understanding and space to heal at his own pace. And somewhere along the way, without him quite realizing it was happening, she had become essential to him. He wrote, "You have been so kind to me. Why?" Margaret smiled, and there was something in her expression that made Ethan's heart beat faster. "Because I care about you," she said simply. "I have cared about you for a long time now." The words hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable. Ethan felt his throat tighten with emotion, felt the words he had been holding back for months pressing against his lips. But still, they would not come. The barrier was still there, solid and immovable. Instead, he wrote, "I care about you too, more than I know how to say." "Then do not say it," Margaret replied, her eyes bright. "Not yet. When you are ready, if you ever are, the words will come. And if they do not, I will still be here. I am not going anywhere." As winter deepened and then began its slow turn toward spring, their relationship evolved in unspoken ways. Ethan would leave small gifts for Margaret, wildflowers he had found on remote parts of the property, a smooth stone from the creek bed, a carved wooden figure of a horse he had whittled during long evenings. She, in turn, continued to visit him, bringing him books and sometimes playing her guitar and singing songs her mother had taught her. Thomas Bailey watched the developing situation with the wisdom of a man who had loved and lost. He saw the way his daughter looked at the silent cowboy, saw the gentle care with which Ethan treated her, and he was satisfied. He had worried about Margaret, about whether she would ever find someone who could match her strength and understand her heart. Ethan Owens, for all his brokenness, seemed to be that man. In late March, as the anniversary of Samuel's death approached, Ethan became withdrawn. He worked harder than ever, pushing himself until he was exhausted, trying to outrun the memories. Margaret recognized what was happening and gave him space, but she made sure he knew she was available if he needed her. The night before the anniversary, Ethan sat with Copper in the corral, his arms wrapped around the mare's neck. "1 year," he said, his voice rough from all the talking he did only to her. "1 full year without him. It feels impossible. How has the world kept turning when he's not in it?" Copper huffed softly and leaned into him, her solid warmth a comfort. Ethan closed his eyes and let himself remember Samuel properly, not just the death, but the life. The time they had stolen watermelons from old Mr. Henderson's patch and gotten caught, the way Samuel had talked their way out of punishment, the winter Samuel had broken his leg and Ethan had done all the chores for 3 months without complaint, the dreams they had shared about building the finest ranch in Kansas, dreams that had died in the dirt of an Arizona canyon. He cried, there in the darkness with his horse, and when the tears finally stopped, he felt emptied out but somehow lighter. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it was not the only thing anymore. There was also Margaret's smile, the way she believed in him without reservation. There was the satisfaction of good work well done, the beauty of desert sunsets, the simple pleasure of Copper's companionship. The next morning, Margaret found him at Samuel's grave. Ethan had ridden out early to the small cemetery outside Agua Caliente where his brother was buried, and he stood there with his hat in his hands, his lips moving in silent words. Margaret dismounted and stood a respectful distance away, waiting. After a while, Ethan turned and saw her. He walked over slowly, his expression raw but not shattered. He pulled out his journal and wrote, "Thank you for coming." "I wanted to be here," Margaret said. "If you wanted me to be." "I did," he wrote. "I do." They stood together in comfortable silence, and then Ethan wrote again, "I think it is time to try, to speak again. I am afraid, but I think you are right. Samuel would not want me to live like this forever." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "You do not have to rush," she said. "There is no deadline." "But there is," Ethan wrote. "I have things I need to say to you, and writing them is not enough anymore." He turned to face her fully, and Margaret saw determination in his eyes mixed with fear but not overcome by it. She reached out and took his hand, squeezing gently. "Then I will wait," she said softly. "However long it takes, I will wait." The process was not sudden or dramatic. Ethan did not wake up the next day able to speak freely to everyone he encountered. Instead, it happened gradually over the following weeks, like ice melting under a persistent sun. He started with single words spoken to Margaret when they were alone. "Yes," he said one afternoon when she asked if he wanted coffee. His voice was raspy and strange even to his own ears, but Margaret's face lit up with such joy that he felt emboldened. "No," he said another day, when she suggested a route for their ride that would take them through particularly rough terrain. "Beautiful," he whispered one evening, looking not at the sunset but at her. Each word was a victory and a struggle, but Margaret celebrated everyone without making him feel pressured for more. She understood instinctively that this was a journey he had to take at his own pace, that pushing would only cause him to retreat back into silence. By late April, he was stringing words together into short sentences. "Thank you for the coffee." "Copper seems restless today." "The fence on the eastern boundary needs repair." And then one warm evening in early May, as they sat on the porch of his cabin watching stars emerge in the darkening sky, Ethan turned to Margaret and spoke a full thought, his voice gaining strength as he went. "I have been thinking about something you said," he began, and Margaret's breath caught because this was more than he had spoken at once since Samuel's death. "About carrying Samuel in joy instead of just sorrow. I think I am ready to try that. And I think, if you are willing, I would like you to help me." "I am willing," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. "I would be honored." Ethan reached out and took her hand, threading their fingers together. "There is something else," he continued, the words coming easier now. "Something I have wanted to say for a long time but could not find the voice for." "You can tell me," Margaret encouraged, "whatever it is." "I love you," Ethan said, and the words felt like they had been torn from somewhere deep inside him, painful but necessary. "I think I have loved you since that day you first brought me water, and did not expect anything in return. You have been patient with me in ways I never deserved, and you have helped me find my way back to living. I love you, Margaret Bailey, and I needed you to hear me say it out loud." Margaret was crying now, tears streaming down her face as she smiled. "I love you too," she said. "I have loved you for so long, Ethan. I was beginning to think I would never get to hear you say it back." He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears. "I am sorry I made you wait," he said softly. "I told you I would wait softly," Margaret replied, "and I meant it. You were worth waiting for." When he kissed her, it felt like coming home after a long exile, like finding water in the desert, like every cliché about love that he had ever dismissed as foolish romance. It was tender and desperate all at once, a year of longing and healing compressed into a single moment. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless. "Will you marry me?" Ethan asked, and he was surprised by his own boldness, but certain of the question. "I know I still have healing to do, and I will always carry some grief for Samuel, but I do not want to wait anymore. I want to build a life with you." "Yes," Margaret said without hesitation. "Yes, absolutely yes." They were married 6 weeks later, in late June of 1877, in a small ceremony at the ranch with Thomas Bailey officiating and most of the ranch hands in attendance. Ethan wore a new suit that Margaret had insisted on buying in town, and she wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her taller frame. Copper and Margaret's palomino were decorated with ribbons and stood witness to the vows. When the time came to speak his promises, Ethan's voice was clear and strong. "I promise to love you with everything I have," he said, holding both of Margaret's hands in his. "I promise to talk to you, not just to my horse." This got a laugh from the assembled guests. "I promise to choose joy when I can, and to let you help me when I cannot. I promise to honor Samuel's memory by living the fullest life I can with you." Margaret spoke her own vows, promising to love him through silence and sound, through grief and joy, through all the years they would share. When they kissed as husband and wife, the assembled crowd cheered, and Ethan felt something he had not experienced in over a year: uncomplicated happiness. They took over the small cabin permanently, and Margaret moved her belongings in with an efficiency that spoke of how ready she had been for this. Thomas gifted them 100 acres of ranch land to start their own herd, an investment in their future that touched them both deeply. The first months of marriage were an adjustment, as any marriage is, but they navigated it with the communication skills they had developed over the previous year. When Ethan had bad days, when the grief rose up and threatened to drown him, Margaret gave him space but made sure he knew she was there. And when he was ready to talk about it, ready to say out loud how much he missed his brother or how angry he still felt about the injustice of it all, she listened without judgment. "Do you ever regret it?" Ethan asked her one night as they lay in bed, the summer heat making sleep elusive. "Marrying a man with so much baggage?" "Never," Margaret said firmly, turning to face him in the darkness. "You are not baggage, Ethan. You are a man who survived something terrible and found his way back. That takes strength, not weakness." "I could not have done it without you," he said honestly. "Maybe," Margaret agreed, "but you did the work. I just waited and believed in you." By fall, they had established a comfortable rhythm in their life together. Ethan worked the ranch alongside the other hands, but also spent time developing the horse training program Margaret had dreamed about. He discovered he had a gift for working with troubled animals, the same patience and gentleness that had helped him survive his own darkness, translating into an ability to reach horses others had given up on. Margaret managed the business side of the ranch, working closely with her father to handle the accounts and plan for expansion. She also started a small garden, coaxing vegetables and herbs from the stubborn desert soil with determination and careful irrigation. Evenings were spent together, sometimes riding out to watch the sunset, sometimes sitting on their porch and talking about the day, sometimes lying in bed and dreaming about the future. Ethan still talked to Copper regularly, a habit he had no intention of breaking. But now Margaret often joined these conversations, the three of them a comfortable unit. In December, Margaret told Ethan she was pregnant, and he felt a rush of emotion so intense he had to sit down. Joy, certainly, but also fear. Fear that something would go wrong, that he would lose her the way her father had lost her mother. Fear that he would not be a good father, that his grief had broken something essential in him. "Talk to me," Margaret said, sitting beside him and taking his hand. "Tell me what you are thinking." "I am terrified," Ethan admitted. "What if something happens to you? What if I cannot protect you?" You cannot control everything, Margaret said gently. Bad things happen, we both know that too well, but good things happen too. We found each other. You found your voice again. We built this life together. Those are miracles, Ethan. Let yourself believe in another one. He pulled her close and buried his face in her hair. I will try, he promised. For you and for this baby, I will try. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, though Ethan was admittedly overprotective, insisting Margaret not overexert herself and worrying about every twinge and discomfort. She tolerated his fussing with amused patience, knowing it came from love and trauma in equal measure. In early July of 1878, on a blazing hot afternoon that had everyone seeking shade, Margaret went into labor. Ethan paced outside their cabin while the midwife and Thomas attended to his wife, tormented by every cry of pain he heard. He talked to Copper constantly during those long hours, his words tumbling over each other in his anxiety. She has to be all right, he told the mare. I cannot lose her. I will not survive it. Copper nuzzled his shoulder as if to say he was being dramatic, and despite his fear, Ethan found himself laughing shakily. You are right, he said. Margaret is strong. She's going to be fine. And she was. When the midwife finally called him inside, Ethan found his wife propped up in bed, sweaty and exhausted, but beaming, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in one of her mother's quilts. Come meet your son, Margaret said, her voice hoarse but happy. Ethan approached on trembling legs and looked down at the baby. He had a shock of dark hair and a red, wrinkled face, and he was perfect. When Margaret placed him in Ethan's arms, he felt something break open in his chest, some last defended wall crumbling under the weight of love for this tiny person. What should we name him? Margaret asked. Ethan looked at his son, then at his wife, then back to the baby. Samuel, he said softly, if that is all right with you. Samuel Thomas for your father and my brother. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. That is perfect, she said. Samuel Thomas Owens. Fatherhood transformed Ethan in ways he had not anticipated. The responsibility of caring for another human being, of teaching and protecting and loving this small person, gave him a sense of purpose that helped push the last shadows of his grief into proper perspective. He still missed his brother, still felt the ache of that loss, but it no longer defined him. Little Samuel was a healthy, happy baby who seemed to have inherited his mother's temperament. He rarely fussed and watched the world around him with alert, curious eyes. Ethan would carry him around the ranch, narrating everything they saw, and Margaret would watch them with a contentment so deep it felt like peace. When Samuel was 6 months old, a stranger rode onto the Bailey Ranch looking for work. He was a weathered man in his 50s with gray hair and hard eyes, and something about him made Ethan uneasy. He could not place it at first, but there was a familiarity to the man's face that nagged at him. The stranger introduced himself as John Mercer and said he had experience with cattle and horses. Thomas was about to hire him when Ethan suddenly realized why the face was familiar. The eyes, the shape of the jaw. It was similar to the man he had seen only briefly that terrible day in April 1876, the man who had shot Samuel. No, Ethan said sharply, and everyone turned to look at him because it was rare for him to use that tone. He cannot work here. Why not? Thomas asked, puzzled by the vehemence. Ethan looked at Mercer, really looked at him, and saw a flash of recognition in the other man's eyes as well. You know who I am, Ethan said, and it was not a question. Mercer's hand drifted toward his gun, and immediately every ranch hand went on alert. You are Ethan Owens, Mercer said slowly. I heard you never spoke again after that day. Guess the rumors were wrong. What day? Thomas demanded, stepping between them. The day his brother shot my son, Mercer said, his voice hard. Over a card game in Agua Caliente, shot him in the back like a coward, so I made sure he paid for it. That is a lie, Ethan said, and his voice was shaking with rage, but also certainty. Samuel was not armed. He never even drew his weapon. Your son shot him in cold blood over an accusation of cheating that was not true. My boy would not lie, Mercer insisted. Your boy is dead, Ethan said bluntly. He died in a saloon fight in Tucson 6 months after he killed my brother. I tracked the story down last year. He was a killer and a cheat, and you know it. The truth of Ethan's words must have shown in his face because Mercer's expression crumpled. The man seemed to age 10 years in an instant. He was still my son, he said, and there was grief in his voice that Ethan recognized all too well. And Samuel was my brother, Ethan replied, his anger draining away to leave only sadness. We both lost people we loved. But coming here will not change that. It will not bring them back. There was a long silence, and then Mercer nodded slowly. You are right, he said. I do not know what I was thinking. I heard your name, heard you were here, and I thought, I do not know. That seeing you would give me some kind of closure, maybe? But there is no closure to this, is there? No, Ethan agreed quietly. There's only learning to live with it. Mercer mounted his horse and rode away, and Ethan watched him go with complicated feelings. He felt no satisfaction in the confrontation, no sense of justice served, only a deep weariness with the cycles of violence and grief that plagued the frontier. Margaret came out of the house where she had been watching from the window with Samuel in her arms. She handed the baby to her father and went to Ethan, wrapping her arms around him from behind. Are you all right? She asked softly. I am sad, Ethan said honestly. Sad for all of it. For Samuel, for Mercer's son, for Mercer himself. For all the ways grief makes people act out of pain instead of reason. You handled it well, Margaret said. You could have shot him, and no one would have blamed you, but you chose differently. Because of you, Ethan said, turning in her arms to face her. Because you taught me that I could choose joy over sorrow, forgiveness over anger, that I could honor Samuel by living well, not by seeking revenge. Samuel would be proud of you, Margaret said, and Ethan felt the truth of it settle into his bones. I think he would be, he agreed. I think he would love you, and he would adore his namesake. And I think he would be glad I found my voice again, even if it took a year of only talking to my horse to get there. They stood together in the fading afternoon light, their son babbling happily in Thomas's arms nearby, and Ethan felt gratitude wash over him. Gratitude for Margaret's patience, for Copper's steady presence during his darkest days, for the grace of second chances and new beginnings. The years that followed were full and rich. Little Samuel grew into a bright, energetic boy who loved horses as much as his father and had his mother's gift for understanding animals. In 1880, Margaret gave birth to a daughter they named Anna Catherine, after both their mothers. She was a spirited child with Ethan's gray eyes and Margaret's determination. The horse training program flourished, with people coming from across the territory to have Ethan work with their animals. His reputation as someone who could reach the unreachable, tame the untamable, spread far and wide. He still spoke to Copper regularly, narrating his thoughts and feelings as he always had, and now his children would join him, the three of them talking to the patient mare as if she were family, which she was. Margaret expanded the ranch's operations, making shrewd business decisions that increased their prosperity. When Thomas Bailey died peacefully in his sleep in 1883, he left the entire ranch to Margaret and Ethan, secure in the knowledge that it was in good hands. In 1884, on the anniversary of the day Ethan had started speaking again, Margaret suggested they take a trip back to Agua Caliente to visit Samuel's grave together as a family. Ethan was hesitant at first, but he agreed, recognizing the importance of teaching his children about their uncle and the impact his loss had had on their father's life. They made the journey in early spring, camping along the way and turning it into an adventure for the children. When they reached the small cemetery, Ethan was struck by how peaceful it looked. The desert flowers blooming around the headstones. Samuel's grave was well maintained, the headstone still standing straight. Ethan knelt before it with his children on either side of him, Margaret standing behind with her hands on his shoulders. "This is your Uncle Samuel," Ethan told his children. "He was brave and kind, and he loved to laugh. He was my best friend, and losing him nearly broke me." "But you got better," 7-year-old Samuel said solemnly. "I did," Ethan agreed, "because your mother waited softly for me to find my way back. She understood that I needed time and silence to heal, and she gave me both without asking for anything in return." "And now you talk all the time," Anna observed, which made both her parents laugh. "I do," Ethan said. "Maybe too much sometimes. But I will never take it for granted again, being able to tell the people I love how I feel about them." He pulled his children close and looked up at Margaret. "Thank you," he said, as he had said countless times over the years, "for seeing me when I could not see myself, for waiting, for believing I would find my voice again." "You are welcome," Margaret replied, as she always did. "Though you did the hard work, I just loved you through it." They stayed at the grave for a while longer, Ethan telling stories about Samuel that made the children giggle and made Margaret smile. When they finally left, Ethan felt lighter somehow, as if he had laid down a burden he had been carrying for too long. On the ride back to the ranch, with his children chattering excitedly about everything they saw and Margaret riding beside him with that smile he would never tire of, Ethan thought about the strange path his life had taken, how a single act of violence had shattered him, how a full year of speaking only to his horse had been what he needed to survive, how one woman's patient love had brought him back to the world. He reached over and took Margaret's hand, squeezing gently. She squeezed back, understanding without words what he was feeling as she always did. That evening, after the children were asleep, Ethan and Margaret sat on their porch watching the stars emerge. Copper wandered over from the corral, and Ethan stroked her neck affectionately. "You know," he said to the mares, "I should probably stop talking to you so much now that I can talk to people again." Copper huffed and nudged his shoulder, and Margaret laughed. "I do not think she would appreciate that," Margaret said. "Besides, I like that you still talk to her. It reminds me of the man I fell in love with, the one who was gentle enough to keep speaking to his horse even when the rest of the world felt impossible." "I was so lost," Ethan said quietly. "If you had not been patient with me, had not understood that I needed to heal in my own way and my own time, I do not know where I would be now." "You would have found your way eventually," Margaret said with confidence, "but I am glad I could walk the path with you." "So am I," Ethan said. He was quiet for a moment, then added, "Do you know what I think about sometimes? That day you first brought me water when I was digging fence posts and ground hard as stone. You could have just left the canteen and gone, but you took the time to say something kind, to acknowledge me as a person, even though I would not speak back. That moment mattered more than you probably realized." "Every moment mattered," Margaret replied. "Every time I chose to sit with you in silence, every time I read aloud or just existed in your space without demanding anything. Those moments built trust between us, built something that could withstand grief and fear and uncertainty." "They built love," Ethan said simply. "A love I will spend the rest of my life being grateful for." Years continued to pass, measured in seasons and harvests, in birthdays and holidays, in the small and large moments that make up a life. Young Samuel grew into a man who combined his father's gentleness with animals and his mother's business acumen, eventually taking over the day-to-day management of the ranch. Anna became a skilled veterinarian, one of the first women in the territory to pursue that profession, and her parents could not have been prouder. In 1895, Ethan and Margaret became grandparents for the first time when Samuel and his wife had a daughter. 2 more grandchildren followed over the next several years, and the ranch house that had once seemed so quiet was filled with the noise and chaos of family gatherings. Ethan, now in his mid-40s, had settled into himself in a way that the young man devastated by grief could never have imagined. His hair had threads of gray at the temples, and there were lines around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun, but he was content in a deep and abiding way. He still thought about his brother Samuel, but the memories no longer brought crippling pain. Instead, they were bittersweet, tinged with both loss and love. He had done what Margaret suggested all those years ago, carried his brother in joy as well as sorrow, lived a full life in Samuel's honor. Copper lived to the impressive age of 27 before finally passing peacefully one spring morning. Ethan found her in the corral and knew immediately she was gone. He sat beside her for a long time, his hand on her neck, remembering everything she had been to him. His confidant, his therapist, his only connection to speech for an entire year. The steady presence that had kept him tethered to the world when he wanted to drift away from it. Margaret found him there and sat down beside him without speaking, just as she had done so many times before. After a while, Ethan said, "She saved my life, you know. As surely as if she had pulled me from a river by letting me talk to her, by listening without judgment, she kept me from disappearing completely into my grief." "She was a remarkable horse," Margaret agreed, "and she lived a long, good life, loved and valued." They buried Copper on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a view of the mountains she had loved to look at. Ethan spoke at the impromptu funeral, attended by family and ranch hands who had all known and admired the chestnut mare. "She was patient with me when I needed patience," Ethan said, his voice steady despite his grief. "She listened when I needed someone to listen. She was my friend during the darkest year of my life, and I will never forget what she meant to me." That evening, Ethan and Margaret took a walk around the property, something they still did regularly even after all these years together. They held hands as they walked, comfortable in the silence that had been such a significant part of their courtship. "Do you ever regret it?" Ethan asked suddenly. "That year you spent waiting for me to find my voice? All the time you invested in a broken man who might never have healed?" Margaret stopped walking and turned to face him, her expression serious. "Ethan Owens, in all the years we have been together, I have never once regretted choosing you. Not for a single moment. Yes, that year was hard, and yes, there were times I worried you might never speak again, but even if you had not, even if you had stayed silent for the rest of your life, I still would have loved you. Because the man you are is not defined by whether or not you speak. It is defined by your kindness, your strength, your capacity for love." "I am a lucky man," Ethan said, pulling her close. "We are both lucky," Margaret corrected. "We found each other and we built something beautiful together. A life, a family, a legacy. That is more than most people ever get." As they stood there in the fading light, Ethan thought about the long journey from that terrible day in 1876 to this peaceful evening in 1898. 22 years of grief and healing, of silence and sound, of learning to live again after devastating loss. It had not been easy, and there had been moments when he thought he would never feel whole again. But Margaret had been right when she said he would not come back but move forward instead. He was not the same man he had been before Samuel's death, but he was a man who had learned to embrace life despite pain, to find joy in the midst of sorrow, to speak his truth even when it felt impossible. In 1902, Ethan and Margaret celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary with a party that brought together friends and family from across the territory. Their children gave speeches about their parents' enduring love, and their grandchildren performed a play they had written about the famous story of how Grandpa had spoken only to his horse for a year until Grandma's patience and love brought him back to the world. Watching his grandchildren act out his darkest time with such innocent joy, Ethan felt overwhelmed with gratitude. This was what it meant to heal, he thought. Not to forget the pain or pretend it never happened, but to integrate it into the story of your life in a way that allowed for growth and happiness. Later that night, after all the guests had gone home and the children had put their exhausted offspring to bed, Ethan and Margaret sat on their porch as they had done thousands of times before. The stars were bright overhead, and the desert air was cool and clear. 25 years, Ethan marveled. When you first started bringing me water and sitting with me in silence, could you have imagined this, all of this? Honestly, Margaret said, I tried not to imagine too much. I just focused on each day, on being present with you, on showing you that you were not alone. The future felt too uncertain to count on. But you waited anyway, Ethan said. You waited softly, without pressure or demands, until I was ready. Because you were worth waiting for, Margaret said, as she had said so many times over the years. You are still worth it every single day. Ethan kissed her then, a kiss that held 25 years of love and partnership and weathering life storms together. When they pulled apart, he rested his forehead against hers and whispered, I love you, Margaret Bailey Owens. I will love you until my last breath and beyond. And I love you, she replied, my silent cowboy who found his voice, my stubborn, gentle, broken, then healed husband. I love you more than words can say. They sat together in the peaceful darkness, two people who had found each other against all odds and built a life that honored both grief and joy, loss and love. The year of silence that had once seemed like an ending had instead been a chrysalis, a necessary period of transformation that led to something stronger and more beautiful than either of them could have imagined. The story could have ended there, with that perfect moment of contentment and reflection. But life does not work in neat endings, and Ethan and Margaret's story continued for many more years. In 1908, they took a trip back to Kansas, the first time Ethan had returned since leaving in the wake of Samuel's death. They visited the old ranch, now owned by another family, and Ethan was surprised to find that he could look at it without the overwhelming grief he had expected. Instead, he felt nostalgia and a certain peace, remembering the good times he and Samuel had shared there. They visited his brother's childhood friends, now middle-aged men with families of their own, and Ethan told them stories about Samuel's life in Arizona before his death. It felt important to keep his brother's memory alive, to ensure that Samuel was more than just the manner of his death, but a full person with dreams and laughter and love. In 1912, Arizona achieved statehood, and Ethan and Margaret celebrated with their community, proud to be part of the official United States. The Wild West they had known in their youth was slowly being tamed, replaced by modern conveniences and changing social norms. Some of the changes were welcome, others less so, but they adapted, as people do, holding on to what mattered and letting go of what no longer served them. Their grandson, also named Ethan, showed the same gift with horses that his grandfather possessed, and Ethan the elder took great joy in teaching the boy everything he knew. They would spend hours in the corral together, the old man and the young boy communicating with the animals in ways that seemed almost magical to observers. Grandpa, young Ethan asked one day in 1915 when he was 12 years old, is it true you did not talk to anyone but your horse for a whole year? It is true, Ethan confirmed, running a brush over the flanks of the horse they were grooming. Why? The boy asked with the blunt curiosity of youth. Ethan considered the question carefully. Because I was in so much pain that words felt impossible, he said finally. My heart was broken, and I did not know how to function in the world anymore. Copper, your grandmother's predecessor, was the only one I felt safe talking to because she did not judge me or expect me to be anything other than what I was. But Grandma helped you, young Ethan said. It was not a question. She did, Ethan agreed. She understood that I needed time and space to heal in my own way. She did not try to rush me or fix me. She just waited, patiently and softly, until I was ready to rejoin the world. That kind of love, that kind of patience, is rare and precious. I hope I find someone like that someday, the boy said wistfully. I hope you do too, Ethan said, ruffling his grandson's hair. And I hope you remember that being strong sometimes means being vulnerable, that it is okay to hurt and to need time to heal. The world will tell you to be tough, to push through pain without acknowledging it, but that is not strength. Real strength is facing your grief, sitting with it, and slowly learning to live alongside it. As the years advanced, Ethan and Margaret grew old together with the grace of two people who genuinely liked each other as much as they loved each other. They moved a bit slower, their joints stiff in the morning, and their eyesight not what it once was, but their connection remained strong. In 1920, on a warm spring evening very much like the one where Ethan had first told Margaret he loved her out loud, they sat on their porch and watched the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. "Do you remember," Margaret said, "that first day I brought you water? You looked so lost and alone, and I thought to myself, that man needs a friend." "Is that all you thought?" Ethan teased gently. "Well," Margaret admitted with a smile, "I might have also thought you were handsome in a sad, brooding sort of way, but mostly I just wanted to help." "You did more than help," Ethan said seriously. "You saved me. As surely as if I had been drowning and you had pulled me to shore. I do not say that lightly or dramatically. It is simply the truth." "We saved each other," Margaret corrected. "You gave my life meaning and purpose. You gave me love and partnership and a family. You gave me a story worth telling." "Some story," Ethan said with a laugh. "Man too broken to speak falls in love with the patient woman who waited for him to find his voice." "It is our story," Margaret said firmly, "and I would not change a single word of it." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, holding hands as they had done for more than 40 years. Then Ethan said, "You know what I think about sometimes? That if Samuel had not died, if I had not gone through that terrible darkness, I might never have met you. I might have stayed in Kansas and married some local girl and had a perfectly nice, ordinary life, and I would never have known what I was missing. Do not misunderstand," he added quickly. "I would trade anything to have Samuel back, to have him alive and well. But since that is not possible, since I had to walk through that fire, I am grateful it led me to you." Margaret squeezed his hand, understanding the complexity of what he was saying. "Life is full of strange turns," she agreed. "Tragedies that lead to blessings, endings that become beginnings. We cannot always understand why things happen the way they do, but we can choose how we respond to them." As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Ethan thought about all the words he had spoken since that pivotal day in May 1877 when he had finally broken his silence. Millions of words probably shared in conversation and laughter and argument and love. Words to his wife, his children, his grandchildren, his friends and colleagues. Words that built relationships and resolved conflicts and expressed the full range of human emotion. But he also thought about that year of silence, about the healing that happened in the space between words, in the patient waiting and gentle presence. That silence had been necessary, he understood now. It had been a cocoon, protecting him while he slowly transformed from a man shattered by grief into someone who could embrace life again. "Thank you," he said softly to Margaret, "for understanding my silence, for waiting softly, for loving me through the worst time of my life and all the beautiful times that came after." "Always," Margaret replied, and in that single word was a lifetime of devotion. Ethan Owens lived to the age of 74, passing peacefully in his sleep in the summer of 1926. Margaret was beside him when he went, holding his hand as she had held it through so many years of joy and sorrow. His last words, spoken in a voice grown raspy with age but still clear in its sincerity, were, "I love you. Thank you for waiting." Margaret lived another 5 years, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who all knew the story of how their matriarch had patiently loved a silent cowboy back to life. She spent her final years sharing that story, emphasizing the importance of patience and understanding, of giving people space to heal in their own time and their own way. When she died in 1931 at the age of 78, she was buried beside Ethan on the hill overlooking the ranch they had built together. Her epitaph, chosen by her children, read, "She understood his silence and waited softly. Her patience was rewarded with a lifetime of love." The ranch remained in the family for generations, each successive owner hearing the story of Ethan and Margaret, of the year he spoke only to his horse, and the woman who loved him through it. It became a family legend, a reminder that healing takes time, that love requires patience, and that sometimes the strongest act of devotion is simply being present without demanding anything in return. And though both Ethan and Margaret were long gone, their love story continued to inspire, a testament to the power of waiting softly, of understanding silence, and of believing that broken people can heal and build beautiful lives if given the patience and love they need. The old ranch house still stood well into the 20th century, weathered but solid, a monument to what two people can build together when they commit to loving each other through darkness and light. And in the corral, there were always horses, descendants of the lines Ethan had so carefully bred and trained, animals known for their gentle temperament and deep intelligence. Sometimes late in the evening when the work was done and the desert air turned cool, you could still hear the cowboys talking to their horses, sharing their thoughts and feelings with the patient animals who listened without judgment. It was a tradition that started with Ethan Owens, maintained throughout his life, and passed down to those who came after. And if you listened very carefully on those quiet evenings, if you let your imagination drift just a little, you might hear echoes of other conversations from long ago. A broken man speaking to a chestnut mare named Copper, working through his grief one word at a time. A woman sitting quietly nearby, reading aloud or simply being present, waiting softly for the man she loved to find his way back to the world. Their story was one of patience and healing, of silence understood and love rewarded. It was a story of the Wild West, but also a story that transcended time and place because the truths it contained were universal. That grief is real and valid and takes as long as it takes. That love can be shown through presence as much as through words. That broken things can be mended if handled with care. That sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is time and space and the assurance that you will be there when they are ready. Ethan and Margaret's love story began with a year of silence and a horse who listened, and it ended with a lifetime of joy and a legacy that would outlive them both. It was, by any measure, a story worth telling, a love worth waiting for, and a testament to the healing power of patience and understanding. And that, finally and completely, is the story of how he spoke only to his horse for a full year, and how she understood his silence and waited softly, and how their patience and love created something that would echo through generations, a reminder that the best things in life are worth waiting for, and that true love understands when words fail and waits for them to return.